Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate.
We believe that there's an option for every student.
We are there to help students and serve them. It's our mission.
And education is transformational. It changes lives.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate.
We believe that there's an option for every student.
Hi everyone, my name is Arij Gabir. I'm a senior in anthropology and molecular and cellular biology. Medicine is mainly comprised of fairly straightforward hard sciences, but it is applied by and for people who can be anywhere along a moral spectrum. Today, our experts will discuss and dissect some of these moral gray areas so that we can reflect upon our opinions about some of these issues, think about how and why we've come to these conclusions, and maybe learn something new along the way. Thank you and enjoy the panel.
Friends, you can turn your cameras on and your microphones on and we can get started. Ben, we're still not seeing your camera. As we are having a little trouble getting our moderator on board with us, we were going to start off with an introduction and a story from George. Would you like to take us away and we'll get this settled while you're getting us started?
Thank you very much. Hello, Jumbo. My name is George. I'm an ICU nurse who uses storytelling to my patients to create a therapeutic milieu for the total healing of the body, the mind, and the spirit. Stories that let my patient know that despite the isolation, we are all in this together. Can I tell you a sample of a story that I share with my patients to let them know that they are not isolated alone? We are all in this together. Are you ready for a story? Can I tell you a story? Are you ready for a story? If I say hadithi hadithi, you say hadithi njo. Hadithi hadithi, hadithi njo. Upa ukwa, pakawa. Can I tell you a story? Are you ready for a story? Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, once upon a time, there was a very blessed lady. This lady, she was so blessed, not just because she had a loving husband and 5 sons and 5 daughters. No, not just because she had 5 sons-in-law and 5 daughters-in-law. No, not just because she had a beautiful garden behind her beautiful house. No, She was so blessed. But in her garden, she grew all sorts of fruits and vegetables. Think about the most delicious mangoes, they were there in her garden. Think of the most tongue-twisting strawberries, they were there in her garden. Think of the most juiciest papayas, they were there in her garden. This woman, she was so blessed, but she had one problem. What do you think her problem was? What do you think this woman's problem was? It wasn't coronavirus. No! This woman, her only problem was a tiny little mouse. A tiny little mouse that could not keep its paws away from this woman's garden. The mouse would nibble on the cocoa, nibble on the yam, nibble on the potatoes, nibble on the cocoa, nibble on the yam, nibble on the potatoes. And this woman, she was fed up. She had enough of this mouse. And she said, I am going to buy a trap to catch this mouse. So the woman, she bought a trap. And as she was setting the trap in the garden, guess who walked by? Yes, the mouse walked by and saw this woman setting a trap in the garden. And the mouse went, what am I going to do? What am I going to eat? But Mouse, he had 3 trusted friends. Mouse, he decided to go to 3 of his trusted friends. His best friend was Mr. Cow. His second best friend was the goat. His third best friend was the chicken. The mouse, he went to Mr. Cow and said, Cow, 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 cow. You see the woman? She's setting up a trap in the garden. Help me, Mr. Cow. Help me, Mr. Cow. Mom, mom, said the cow. You see, my neck is too big to get trapped in that trap. I don't mess with man. You on your own, bro. You on your own. And the mouse, he didn't know what to do. He went to his second best friend, the goat. By this time, the mouse was so hungry, his stomach was touching his spine. He went to the goat and said, Mr. God, help me, Mr. God. You see the woman, she's setting up a trap in the garden. What am I going to eat? Help me, Mr. God, help me. Nah, 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 nah. I don't mess with man. That's why I eat grass. My neck is too big to get caught in that trap. You on your own, said the goat. The mouse, he went to his next best friend, the chicken, and said, Mr. Chicken, please help me. The woman, she's setting up a trap in the garden. Help me, what am I going to eat? Quack, 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 said the chicken. I don't mess with man. I eat grass. Yes, high fiber, low calorie. You should try too. You know what to do. But in the garden, there was a snake. The snake was coming to eat the mouse. But this snake got caught in the trap. And the snake, he gave out such a huge hiss. When the woman had the hiss, she came running to the garden. She came running. Whoop! But the snake lifted up its head and bit the woman. And the woman, she died. But because this woman was so famous and everybody loved her, people came from all over the world to her funeral. Oh, those who came to eat and gossip, they were there. Those who came to chitter chatter, they were there. Those who came to gossip and slander, they were there. People, they ate, they drank, and they ate everything. And somebody stood up and said, what are we going to feed the guests? They ate everything. Someone said, wait a minute. This woman, she has a cow. Get the cow. So they got the cow. And as they were putting the knife on the neck of the cow, sorry, vegetarians, the mouse walked by And so the cow said, you see, Mr. Cow, you see, it is the trap that caught the snake. Now the woman is dead, and you are going to. And people, they had barbecue, they ate, they drank, and they went home. After a week, according to the ceremony of these people, they came back again to stand on the grave. Oh, those who came to Untitled Chapter, they were there. Those who came to eat and gossip, they were there. Everybody was there. They ate, they drank, they ate everything. And somebody said, what are we going to feed all these guests? Someone said, you know this woman, she has a goat. Oh, they brought the goat. And as they were putting the knife on the neck of the goat, sorry, vegetarians, guess who walked by? The mouse walked by and said, you see, Mr. Goat, you see, Mr. Goat, it is a trap that caught the snake. Now the woman is dead, the cow is dead, and you two are going to. And the people, they ate and dispersed. After another week, this woman, she had a son who lived abroad. When the son came back to the funeral, the son was asked, what would you like us to cook for you? The son came from India and said, I want some tandoori chicken. I want tandoori chicken. And people say, hey, we don't have tandoori chicken in this village. But another man stood up and said, wait, this woman, she has a chicken. Oh, they brought the chicken. And as they were putting the knife on the neck of the chicken, sorry, vegetarians, the mouse came by and told you see chicken, it is the trap that caught the snake. The woman is dead, the cow is dead, the goat is dead, and you two are going to. And people, they ate, they drank. And the funeral and the standing on the grave, everything was over. Your problem, my problem, becomes our problem very, very quickly. Ladies and gentlemen, where do you think the mouse is now? The mouse, I'm told, is sitting somewhere in Jamaica, relaxing on the beach, smoking Jamaican cigarettes. Your story affects my story. We are all in this together. Thank you for listening. I yield back to you.
That was wonderful, Georgia. Thank you. Hi, this is Ben Kyden. I'm sorry I had technical difficulties and missed, but I was glad to see that wonderful story. I'm not sure, did they have a chance to introduce George or any of the panel yet? Maybe I'll just start with that. George, thank you so much. I'm going to welcome you all to the Conference on World Affairs and the topic, Your Conscience and Healthcare. We're going to focus really on conscience and healthcare. And you've all met George, and in a few minutes, I'll introduce the rest of our speakers. All the panels are being recorded on YouTube and will be available after to watch on the CWA YouTube channel. And you may submit questions at any time. We're going to do our best to incorporate your questions and make sure we get your audience participation. Thank you very much for joining us. As you saw, we wanted to begin with a story from George. And George Ochiano is also known as Fishmonger Stories, who is a critical care RN who has roots in Kenya and branches in India and Detroit, my hometown, and has a graduate degree in accounting and nursing. And his hobby is telling African stories, riddles, and proverbs to children and adults in the hospital to bridge cultural gaps and preserve oral literature for the next generation. He's been working in Detroit and Houston, and you can see his YouTube channel called Fishmonger Stories, which has been featured on the news. And we're going to do another story in the transition. Thanks a lot, George. The rest of, and I want to just structure our panel a little bit. I'm going to introduce all the panelists. We have a really amazing panel of experts from the US, mostly Colorado, but Utah as well, in a wide variety of fields on ethics and health-related ethics. And so I'm going to make sure that they have most of the time to talk. And we're going to start for maybe the first 20 minutes or so talking about how the current pandemic has had an influence on ethics and some of the ethical dilemmas on consciousness and healthcare. and conscience and healthcare. And then we're going to make sure to pivot, because I think we all have a little COVID fatigue, and we want to talk more broadly about conscience and healthcare, about some of the more broad topics around ethics. So without further ado, I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Matt Winia. Dr. Winia is the director of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at CU Anschutz. He's been involved in really all things related to ethics, including developing a research institute at the AMA, and you've probably heard of the American Medical Association, and the AMA Center for Patient Safety. He's led projects on a wide variety of ethic related topics, and has been on the governor's expert panel around ethical issues related to COVID and elsewhere, as well as Gene Abbott, one of our other speakers, has contributed to that as well. He has served on many committees, including the Joint Commissions and the American Board of Medical Specialties, and is really well published, including JAMA, the New England Journal, Annals, it goes on, really all the major journals. Wide variety of expertise. And why don't we let you take it from there, Matt, and start us off on our discussion on conscience and health. Thanks.
Oh, thanks so much, Ben. I have to say that is a really hard act to follow, George. I had not had the opportunity to hear the story before, and it's a terrific story. It reminds me very much, by the way, we are, for those who don't know this already, in the middle of the federally designated week of remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust. And I don't know if this is what the story brought to other people's mind, but there's a very famous speech by Pastor Martin Niemöller about the experience of the Germans leading up to the Holocaust, where he starts saying, first they came for the socialists, and I didn't stand up because I'm not a socialist. And then they kept and he goes on about all the different groups that were eventually taken away. And your story reminded me of that, I think perhaps because we're in the midst of this week of remembrance. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which that terrible legacy continues to impact the way we think about bioethics and medical ethics issues today. I wanted to start with maybe a reflection on the "we're all in this together" theme that I think you've really put forward here. There's an old joke about how do we define politics, and the Jay Leno's joke definition of politics is show business for ugly people. This is where I really wish we were live, because it's a lot harder to tell a dumb joke like that to a blank screen. But really, I'll tell you one more, because Gene is laughing. The other definition of politic is that it comes from the Greek, poly meaning many, and tick meaning blood-sucking insect. Okay, I'm done now. I'll be back next week. But politics is, in fact, the art and the practice of what you're talking about, right? Politics in reality, right? We can't get away from this. And this has been particularly prevalent in our conversations around the COVID pandemic and how we manage it, because politics is the process through which we come together to make decisions about who gets what are the rules, what are we willing to trade off together. And so this issue sort of lays at the base of many of the ethical dilemmas that we have faced during this pandemic. The base of many of these dilemmas is the question, what gives the government or a business or any other organization the right to tell me what to do, right? To close businesses, to require masking, to potentially require vaccines, right? And at the base of this is a philosophical understanding of what we come together to do as a community, right? Famously, this goes back to the original libertarian, a guy named John Stuart Mill, who put forward this thing called the harm principle, which essentially said the purpose for which you can exercise power over someone else within a civilized community against that person's will is only if you're trying to prevent harm to other people, right? So we can have stop signs, we can have speed limits. These are things that constrain our liberties, right? I'd rather not stop. I'd rather drive faster. But we agree as a community that we can put these limits on our freedoms as a way to prevent us from inadvertently or advertently harming each other. And the sort of the way this often is framed is my right to swing my arm ends just at the tip of your nose, right? So yes, we have personal liberties, we have personal freedoms, and the state is allowed to infringe on those only if it's to prevent harm to others. And this is what has come up in these public health discussions about what gives the government the right, legally and morally, to infringe on individual liberties. And it opens this big debate about how certain do you have to be of the harm? How certain do you have to be that this infringement on liberty you're proposing, right? Your mask mandate, your business closure, how certain do you need to be that that will actually stop the harm? Is that infringement really necessary, or is there some less restrictive means of getting to the proposed goal? And these are absolutely active debates up to this moment. In the last couple of weeks, there was a Supreme Court decision about the state of California saying that they cannot, as a state, limit gatherings in churches in the same way that they are allowed to limit gatherings at baseball games or concerts or other conferences and so on. So this is still very active debate. They did not, by the way, give a specific reason why church gatherings cannot be disallowed while conferences can be disallowed. So this is still under debate. What exactly are the parameters? And this, you'll see a ton of articles about this right now around vaccination, whether individual organizations in the private sector, universities, states, the federal government, do any of those have the legal or the moral authority to require people to get vaccines? And we'll probably get a chance to talk more about this later, but I'll just say there's a lot of debate about vaccination mandates right now. And to my mind, one of the interesting things about that is to just think about what do we mean by a mandate? So if United Airlines says, we won't let you get on our airplane unless you can prove that you've been vaccinated, is that a vaccine mandate? Right? It's not a government mandate, it's private sector. But that's a significant life activity for a lot of people. And anytime you're saying you can't go do this significant life activity if you don't do this other thing, it's at minimum coercive, and you might call that a mandate. So that kind of question about what kinds of things can private sector organizations require, and are they infringements on our personal liberties, is going to play out, over the next 6 months or so, I would guess. We do, of course, have a lot of vaccine mandates already, right? You can't work in a healthcare organization without getting your annual flu shot, by and large. So we've grappled with these things before, and we'll be grappling with these around the COVID pandemic for some time. But underlying all of that is the notion that, if you're a private business and you don't want to be the source of an outbreak and you want to keep your employees healthy, that's all around this harm principle, right? This employer, the university, for example, might say, look, we are justified in infringing on the freedom of students and employees and so on, if we require them to get a vaccination before they come back to campus, because that's to prevent harm to others. It also protects them, of course. These vaccines are quite effective at preventing you from getting sick. So it protects you, but even more importantly, in terms of the moral argument, is that the requirement that you get vaccinated could be justified if it's to protect you from inadvertently harming other people. So I'll just stop there, because I know we've got a lot of more ground to cover.
And thanks, Matt. You really opened up some topics that I think we might want to get back to around, so maybe you should prepare, because I think there might be specific questions in the audience minds around colleges and universities that are talking about mandates, and in many of our minds, healthcare organizations around mandates that are really happening nationally, and eventually I think will come to a place near you. So balancing that people's autonomy with the public good, which is, I think, is sort of where you were getting to. So let's plan to come back to that. Thank Matt. And I want to introduce Dr. Margaret Pabst Batten, also known as Peggy. And Peggy, thank you for joining us from Utah. Peggy is a distinguished professor of philosophy and adjunct professor of internal medicine and the Division of Medical Ethics at the University of Utah. She's the author of prize-winning short stories and recipient of University of Utah's Distinguished Research Award, and has authored and co-authored about 20 books. Peggy has lots of expertise in this area around end of life, religious related questions around ethics, questions around euthanasia, assisted suicide. And I was noticing she received the Rosenblatt Prize at the University of Utah, which is their most prestigious award, and named a distinguished honors professor. So we're so glad you could join us, Peggy. And without further ado, why don't you open up on the topic of conscience in healthcare.
Okay, I'm very happy to be here, and I've come all the way from Utah to Colorado. So this is from foreign territory, you might say, but it's good to be here. Now, I'm going to talk about what I think should be an issue of conscience with respect to COVID and pandemics generally. And it's an issue that I think has been overlooked. And so I'm going to frame it at the time when these are pressures about access, were most intense. That's during the earliest parts of this pandemic, most conspicuously in Italy, but also preparations for this were made in New York. So I'm going to tell you what I think the problem is, and 4 things that might help to resolve this problem a little bit. So this is about triage. And the situation at hand is one in which there are, let us assume, 2 at least people who were equal candidates for a scarce resource. The early discussions were all about ventilators. And indeed, I think practically every state and many large healthcare systems developed ventilator triage policies for who would get the ventilator if there weren't enough to go around, and more people were qualified or needed the ventilator than there were ventilators available. Now, the problem's changed a little bit as we've discovered that actually in treating COVID, serious illness in COVID, sometimes ventilators aren't what you need, but you still need things like ICU beds, medications, staff that can operate whatever stuff you might need, might include dialysis. There are many things that could be scarce. So the argument I'm going to make applies to all of that, and applies, of course, to other scarcity situations in healthcare outside COVID. So the question is, in a triage situation, there may be policies, et cetera, that dictate who gets the ventilator, but what never gets looked at, or only with the briefest of mention, is what do we owe the triaged out? That is, the person who doesn't get the ventilator. The other guy got it, you didn't. So I think this is really an issue of conscience, in which we have to recognize that we need to treat the person who's triaged out with equal respect, you might say, as we treat the person who is lucky enough to get the vent or the other important thing. So I invite you to try to think about this issue from the vantage point of the person who didn't get the vent, who's triaged out. And I'd suggest that there are 4 things that you might want, you should be entitled to, and that are important, and that as a matter of conscience in a healthcare system, we should make sure that you get all 4 of these. Okay, first, I think you have a right to information, and that includes information about the nature of the disease at hand. This would be COVID in this case, what the likely prognosis is, what the likely prognosis, if we can tell, for you is, but also why you didn't get the vent that somebody else got. Was it because of a difference in circumstances? Was it because you couldn't pay and they could? Or was there some form of discrimination going on? Or were you treated as part of a larger group and not assessed on in terms of your own personal individual likelihood of profiting from access to the vent or whatever it was? So, information. Second, I think you should be able to understand yourself as having a right to personal choice. Now, that might include the choice to decline the vent, right? And there are people who have done that even though they would have profited from it themselves, right? You should also have personal choice about whether you have the right to try alternative or unproven medications. There's been, of course, lots of discussion of highly touted unproven medications. The right to try those, provided at least within reason, seems to me something that you might be entitled to, given that being triaged out means you're more likely to die. You might have should think of yourself as the right to enroll in or refuse to enroll in clinical trials, to know whether any treatment you are offered is actually part of research, where being in the randomized to the non-treatment arm might be equivalent to being triaged out. There are many things that you waste about, even though your biggest choice, that is getting the vent, didn't come through. Third, I think the right to communication is essential, right? Now, there's lots of discussion about social isolation and preventing family members or others from hospital visits, from access to you, not allowed in the institution or not favored in some way. But we have to remember, especially for someone who is triaged out, that is much more likely to die, the personal visit and the opportunity to say goodbye, to make parting wishes, to perhaps wish a visit from one's personal religious advisor, not just the hospital chaplain, although the hospital chaplain may be wonderful, but your own personal religious or other advisor is particularly important. All of those things are things that as a society we didn't do. That is, patients with COVID did not have access to individual visits. But of course, there are ways to facilitate contact even without in-person visits. Laptops, iPads, and so on. So that's not just a matter of, well, you happen to have a laptop. It's a matter of expecting a system, an institution that has decided in favor of somebody else to still make every effort it can to provide you with the means of contact to parties you care about. A simple example told to me by nurses at some point is that people would arrive at the hospital with their cell phones, but without a charger cord, right? So that's a particularly simple matter where an institution can favor communication by, providing hookups at almost no expense. But I think this communication, particularly if you're facing death, might be the most important thing of these four things. And fourth, out. I think you have the right, as far as possible, of course, hospice and palliative care, and some of it with shortened waiting times, fewer hoops to jump about consultations, and so on. So those are must regard as a matter of conscience as we develop our, that we, for those who don't get access to, cannot simply kick people to the curb. Sorry, you didn't get it. Tough luck, fellow. That's unconscionable, and we mustn't do it. After all, we are, as George has tried to tell us, all in this together. And in any scarcity situation like this, we, you, I, could be the ones carefully about what we do to people. Even now that these situations don't seem to be at hand for this phase of this pandemic, in a future for which we should be more prepared than we are. Thanks.
Thanks, Peggy. I think that's some really poignant points around this social isolation. Really came up a lot in our work here in Boulder. And I'm going to transition to Jean, because I think we're going to come back to some of these topics. And then if there's questions, we'll definitely get back to whatever folks are interested in. So Dr. Jean Abbott is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Emergency Medicine and has been at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and Andrews Medical Center as an emergency medicine attendant for 34 years. She retired recently, but remains on the ethics consultation service at University of Colorado and Boulder Community. And she's been instrumental in areas such as advanced care planning, the Conversation Project, medical aid in dying, and other end-of-life issues, and really been a leader locally, regionally, nationally around end-of-life related topics and broader related to ethics. So Jean, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks. I'm going to make my in this together that George has so nicely kicked off and talk about what drives us to care for others and how that has been under a lot of moral distress. They have never seen so many people die on their shifts by the week. This has been an extended pandemic where the stresses of overtime and of caring for so many patients who are critically ill has never been seen before in their professional life. The responsibilities for patients and their loved ones has been incredibly stressful. People have left the field. I don't think we've seen yet the residual that will happen from the moral injury that is occurring and being reflected. Our governor decided to lift the mask mandate, being stressed incredibly by lack of, but the ethical questions that have become so much more prominent in this pandemic time are certainly someplace that we wanted to start with.
Thanks to all of you. Really great introductory remarks. And before we're going to do a transition to go to more general ethical topics and have George do a story. But before we do that, I thought maybe we'd spend a few minutes. I thought I might bring in some of the topics Peggy talked about and what Jean was talking about, which is, healthcare workers are burning out at tremendous rates. And at the peak of the pandemic, we had things like ICU nurses taking care of 2 patients in a room, sharing a vent, et cetera. And maybe there wasn't enough staff to do all of these things that we were talking about, like making sure people had chargers and make sure people, like I had technical difficulties today. Think about 90-year-olds who have COVID and maybe aren't breathing that well. Think about them getting their laptop and their Zoom meeting with their family. So certainly we want to support those people, but there's this tension here where you've got people kind of on the edge. And then we're saying, in addition to take care of this ventilated people, can we also have, you walk over there, take off all your gear or whatever, and then provide communication support. And, and I think that there's just, everybody wants to do this, but there's a real tension there in is there enough resources to do all of this? And I just wanted to bring that up because I think this is what we're seeing in reality is there's a lot of aspirational goals, and then there's certain resource limitations. I just would open that up for conversation for a minute or two. You're on mute, Peggy.
Peggy, you're on mute, but if you want to jump in, I'll pile on after you're done.
Okay, well, I was just going to say the obvious. The worries about resource limitation are ubiquitous, but they're also a function of policy. So somebody, some group, somewhere is busy deciding what's available and to whom it's to be made available. And that means to whom it's not to be made available or not be provided in the first place. So with every decision, with every scarcity, with every access question, there are two.
Which brings it, so two quick points. One is this brings this back to the political arena.
Yeah.
Right? There's no possible way to have these conversations without. Brief point is, I think Peggy just alluded to this, these are decisions and major issues, right? As Jean can probably elaborate, the issue of burnout among health professionals, this is not something we haven't been thinking about, right? There has been a burnout crisis with higher rates of suicide. This a topic of conversation for the entire of our communities. And the problems in our healthcare system that we never quite got the momentum to this pandemic, right? There's very famously in disasters, people often talk about, coming out of disasters with post-traumatic stress. But there are also ways in which people come out of disasters with post-disaster resilience. They actually come out stronger and more cohesive as a community than they were before the disaster. That's actually pretty common after, wildfires, after hurricanes, after floods. Communities come together and they are more cohesive in the wake of a disaster than they were before it. And I would like to believe that our nation and our world has an opportunity right now to come out of this, slow rolling, long lasting disaster.
Never in the history of the world has there been such a dire need for judicious use of wisdom. Can I tell you a story on wisdom? Are you ready to listen to a story on wisdom? Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, once upon a time in Nigeria, there was a group of people known as the Ogoni men. Ogoni men and women, they believed that all wisdom under the surface of the earth was given to them by God. They believed that all wisdom was given and they owned all the wisdom. Therefore, they walked with their heads up, chins up, chest up, because they believed they owned all the wisdom of the world. But of all the Ogoni men, there was one man who was believed to be the most wisest man ever in the world. Oh, this man, his name was Oludumare. Oludumare, he was so wise. Whatever question you asked him, he had the answer. Oh, Oludumare, he was the original Google before Google. If you ask Oludumare, how long does it take the sun to rise from the east all the way to the west? He knew the answer. If you ask Oludumare, how long does it take a grain of maize to germinate from the root all the way till harvest time? He knew the answer. If you ask Oludumare, how many teeth are there in the mouth of the most ferocious crocodile? He knew the answer. If you ask Oludumare, how many strands of hair do I have from the sole of my feet all the way to the crown of my hair? He knew the answer. If you ask Oludumare, how many wigs does Donald Trump have? He knew the answer. That's how wise Oludumare was. But two teenage boys set in their hearts to trick him, to make a fool of him, to make Oludumare look unwise. They thought long and hard, how do we trick Oludumare? How do we make him look unwise? And they came up with what they thought was a brilliant idea. In front of everybody in the marketplace, we are going to ask Oludumare a tricky question. This is what they decided to do. They went and caught a butterfly and they said, we are going to put a butterfly in our hands. And in front of everybody in the marketplace, we are going to ask Oludumare if this butterfly is dead or alive. If he says it's dead, open your hands and release the butterfly. If Oludumare says the butterfly is alive, all you have to do is crush the butterfly and show a dead butterfly. And that was brilliant. Put a butterfly in the palms of their hand ask Oludumare in front of everybody in the marketplace, Oludumare, is this butterfly dead or alive? If he says dead, just open your hands and let the butterfly fly away. If he says alive, just crush it and show a dead butterfly. Oh, the marketplace was full of everybody. Oludumare, he stood at his usual corner. Oh, the young boy, they came in front of Oludumare and asked him, Oludumare, tell us this day, is this butterfly dead or alive? Is this butterfly dead or alive? Old man, tell us, is this butterfly dead or alive? Old man, dead or alive? Dead or alive? Dead or alive? Old man, tell us, dead or alive? Is this butterfly dead or alive? Old man, tell us. Oludumare, he kept quiet. Is this butterfly dead or alive? Old man, tell us, is this butterfly dead or alive? Dead or alive? Oludumare, he broke into a song. Owesa wiona yawe, katonda so ifu, niwe ngene no sugwe, katonda so ifu, niwe ngene no sugwe, katonda so ifu, Yahweh. He looked at the young man and said, the answer is in the palms of your hand. The answer is in the palms of your hand. For how long shall you shun wisdom? For how long shall you despise wisdom? The answer is in the palms of your hand. Wisdom is always at the palms of your hand. You choose whether you want to use it or not. But wisdom is always at the palms of your hand. Whether you use it or not, it is always at the palm of your hand. Are you going to choose wisdom? Thank you.
Wow, we knew we had some good stuff in store for us. George, I'm going to have you come to all of my meetings to sort of get us to a little broader topic here. I really appreciate that. That was great. It's hard to transition. So I think we're going to talk a little bit more about broad ethical issues, which I think George was a good transition point to that. So conscience in healthcare more broadly, and I think in the absence of specific questions, maybe we'll go to sort of the topic of universal access, which has become kind of a buzzword or a really important point with the laws going through Colorado legislature, and there's a lot of debate going on locally. And I think we'll start, maybe I'll turn to you, Matt, to sort of start us off around this conversation, and maybe you can fill us in about what's happening in Colorado right now.
Sure. I actually love this transition because to me, well, first of all, George, your story made me think of Schrodinger's cat. I don't know if you are familiar with this thing in quantum mechanics, but the cat is inside a box, and it is therefore both alive and dead simultaneously. It's only after you open, this is related to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle as well. So it's only after you open the box that you are forced to make this decision. But in essence, what you've brought to this is it's your choice, right? In fact, we have these choices. And in terms of, access to healthcare, the reason why we don't have universal access to high quality healthcare in the United States is because we have chosen policies, options that don't allow that. Right? These are choices that we have made over time. And I think Peggy alluded to this earlier. These are policy choices, but they're also individual personal choices. And so what's going on in Colorado right now is we are being faced as a community, both those of us who make our living in healthcare and those of us who are patients and consumers, if you will, of healthcare services. We are being faced with this choice of what are we willing to give up in order to achieve this broad goal. And it's being put forward in Colorado in a very stark way right now, because the way the bill, and I assume not everyone online here is in Colorado and sort of is following this story. So I'll just give you a quick summary. The idea here is that there would be a public option that anyone could enroll in, just as they could enroll in any other plan. And that public option health plan would be in competition with the private sector health plans that are already out there. This public option health plan would only come into existence if all of these private health plans fail to reduce their cost by 20% over the next 2 years. Now, since healthcare costs never go down, rarely go down, and they certainly don't go down by 20%, by a fifth in just a couple of years, I think we should assume that there will be, if this were to pass, there will be a public option healthcare plan implemented. But that's the sort of phase one of this, is they put this forward. If the health plans that are already out there fail to reduce their cost by 20%, then this new public option would come in and serve as a competitor in the healthcare marketplace in Colorado. This public option would have some tremendous advantages, namely, every doctor and every hospital would have to agree to take their payments as full payment in full. So you would have access, if you enrolled in that plan, you would have access to every doctor and every hospital in the state, and they would all have to take payment in full, and that plan would pay 20% less. So that's how you get the reduced costs, right? Is by paying people less for the services that they are delivering. It's only the things that the state would have some control over. So the state has no control essentially over drug prices, for example, or the cost of a left ventricular assist device or other medical devices that are sometimes very expensive, but we can't control those costs as a state. So the state would be stuck trying to reduce costs of healthcare overall by 20% with really only one lever, which is pay doctors and hospitals less. And this is why doctors and hospitals have come out very strongly against this, because they don't like the idea of their of being paid 20% less for everything that they do. It could be that there's some nuance there. You know, maybe some people would get paid no less. Maybe you could imagine primary care being paid a little more and specialty care being paid a little less. You know, things like that could happen, I suppose. There's no details of that in the bill that is currently in front of the legislature. But that's the basic thing that's going on right now. And, you know, there are doctors and hospitals and clinics that are saying, look, if we had a 20% pay cut, we would have to close. And that is undoubtedly true for some. So that's the issue as it sits on the table. But I think the broader issue, you know, because that's a lot of detail, the broader issue is, what are the trade-offs that we're willing to make? Because there are a lot of us who make our living in healthcare, who get paid, right? So every excess dollar in healthcare is someone's paycheck.
Yes.
And that's the trade-off that we're looking at, is, you know, is anyone willing to give up anything? And few people are, and therefore, you know, we continue on this path of sort of a marketplace that is a little bit out of control, and that costs more and more, and where, you know, pricing is quite opaque and so on. Sorry, that was less ethics and more politics and economics. But
yeah, I think it does open a lot of really poignant, you know, and I recognize I work for a health system and I am a physician, so I probably have some, you know, sort of vested interest here. But in a free society, does the government get to decide, you know, they can just blanket cut the payments to all hospitals and physicians? Is that a reasonable thing? You know, what about investment bankers? What about pharmaceutical companies? What about device makers? What about all these other people who have margins much higher than you know, our margins in Boulder are about 1 or 2%. So if we drop 20%, we will probably, you know, have to become part of a large national health system. Is that something we want the government to decide? And I think that's just like an ethical quandary. And I'd open it up to our ethicists on the panel, maybe Margaret or Peggy. Sorry, would you like to comment?
Sure, because we can look at this from another perspective. So one of the bugaboos in this discussion is the threat of socialized medicine. That's been headed at us all along. Socialized medicine, how awful. Well, guess where the largest socialized medicine system in the world is? It's actually right here. It's the VA, right? Government doctors, government nurses, government policies, government equipment, government everything, right, is provided under the VA, which at the height of its flourishing, it's been sort of resolutely defunded recently, but it's at the height of its flourishing had better better performance in many indices of excellence. So supposing we rethought what it would be like if we had the VA become general in this country. So they'd have to buy a few more hospitals and buildings and hire some more doctors and more nurses. But to accommodate I see you making such a face, Ben. What an awful idea. In order to accommodate everybody who is currently underinsured or uninsured, you open the doors of the VA to everybody, but they're not all sick at once. In fact, the people who are under or uninsured are younger. They're not old enough for Medicare. They're older than babies, typically. And a system like that could accommodate all the people who in this country are without health insurance probably pretty easily. Would this be a bad thing? Well, the leaving people out of healthcare seems a matter of conscience, and that includes everybody who's in the country, regardless of document status and other such matters. Healthcare isn't a commercial good or shouldn't be thought of that way. This is I see it as a profoundly important and basic right. So think about it, open the doors of the VA to everybody. In fact, I don't know whether it's a matter of legal reality, it's possible, but we have a commander-in-chief who presumably can get anything military under his direction to do it, right? Hey, Joe, open the VA tomorrow and our problem is solved.
That is, if you could find the people to staff it. I'd like to highlight what Matt was saying, also mixed in with what Peggy was saying, which is that we have to decide as a society, and here's perhaps the ethics question, what we're willing to sacrifice in order to bring everybody up to a level where we do have equity in the services we provide. And we're thinking about this in several arenas. We're thinking of this as we discuss Black Lives Matter. Are there things that I, who have white privilege, are willing to sacrifice in order to bring everybody up to getting either reparations or an equal opportunity to universities or an equal opportunity to healthcare? You can't just say, fine, bring everybody else up. Yeah, maybe the VA has some negatives, Peggy, but it also has a lot of positives, and to bring everybody to that level is really a question of conscience and a question of ethics, I think.
And it's dramatically, I mean, this is posed sort of as a joke, but not entirely. The VA is dramatically cheaper because its overhead costs are so much lower. So the 20% is just imagine that as a figure might be doable if you did it in a way like that, right?
Yeah, I think some of the trade-offs though that would be you might have to wait a lot longer or might not be able to get a knee replacement or, so I think there are, I mean, the VAs are great and they're really good at certain quality metrics like vaccination, for example, colonoscopy. So they have some really outstanding quality data for sure. But they also have some things that I'm not saying me personally, but Americans I think would really struggle with the rationing of care that would occur like you see in England where my family's from, where you see that people sometimes wait a year or two for surgeries that in the US would be scheduled in a week or two. And that gets to that question of what are we willing to give up? And I'm not saying it's unreasonable to ask people to wait, but I'm saying are people in the US willing to wait? And I think that's a question that I guess I would pose. Are people willing to give up the things that it would require to allow, better vaccinations and better primary care? And, I don't know the answer to that.
It does a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, it does a little bit raise the question. I mean, the UK spends half what we do on medical care. So if you took that system and double funded it to take up 20% of the gross domestic product, as we pay, I'll bet you wouldn't have those kind of waiting in lines. This is a conversation I had many times with an old friend in Chicago who's now passed away. But his sense was if the U.S. were to ever adopt a universal insurance program of whatever type, whether it's through the VA or through Medicare or whatever it is, that plan would actually be probably overfunded and would still continue to spend more on useless medical services because the US public has such a demand. And by the way, things that are politically accountable tend to overspend, not so much underspend. So his sense was, right now what we have is rationing of medical care by corporations.
Right.
And corporations will ration medical care in ways that the government could never get away with, because the government has levels of accountability that a corporation does not have.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe we should transition to, I don't know if there's other topics we want to talk about, but I did want to kind of get back. We only have a couple minutes to the vaccine requirements, because I think in the university setting, which this is a university event, I think this is really going to come up by the fall. So I just was curious, we talked about that dilemma around, is this allowed? Can we mandate in healthcare systems? Can we mandate it in universities? And I just, maybe we should close on that topic. And I guess I'll open it up to the panel.
Well, so Matt's discussion of the harm principle is a very good introduction to this notion. So the vaccine mandate is not just about you, it's about the other person. And it's the other person that is at issue here. It seems to me that unless you have some biological health reason for not being vaccinated at all, or some other particular kind of problem, that you owe it to everyone else to be vaccinated. That's a moral obligation, even if it's not a legal one.
This, by the way, is why vaccines often end up needing a mandate. If a vaccine is effective, right, the more people who get it, the less common the illness becomes, and the less people have an incentive to want to get the vaccine themselves, because the disease is not widespread in the community anymore. So why should I get a vaccine? And we watched this, early in our history, throughout the early part of the last century, where there would be waves where everyone would get vaccinated because they were very scared of the disease. And then the disease would go away because everyone's vaccinated. And then people would stop getting the vaccine. They would forget how bad the disease was. They would not want to take any risk in getting a vaccine. And every vaccine, it's a therapeutic. Of course, it comes with side effects and so on. So people would stop getting the vaccine because after all, the disease is gone. And then the disease would come back. And we would see these waves. And it was, so this is why in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we started seeing vaccine mandates, because we realized as a policy matter, if you don't mandate this, you are forced to watch waves of of people making individual decisions about whether it's worth it right now to get the vaccine. So you have to make it more worth it to get the vaccine, even when the disease is not widespread in your community at that moment. So it's very common for these vaccines to require a mandate eventually. And I think there will be types of, I'm almost certain of this, because this vaccine, incredibly effective, very safe. We now have, many, many millions of people who've received it. It's got relatively low rates of any kinds of significant side effects. So I think you will see mandates for this. This question about, can you mandate something while it's still under an emergency use authorization? I think legally is probably not as contentious as it's been made out to be. We have mandated other things that are under EUAs. Every test kit for COVID right now is on an emergency use authorization. They don't have full FDA approval, and yet many places are mandating that you get testing. The NBA, right? All of the sports leagues, including NCAA. So we are already mandating the use of things that are under an EUA. I think it could be contested, but I expect you will see mandates to get this vaccine in the very near future. And then this question arises: what counts as a mandate, right? What are the penalties for failing to get the vaccine? And the penalty may be things like you can't go to the bar, and you can't get on an airplane, and you may have to change your job because your employer requires you to get the vaccine. Those are not, you're not going to go to jail for it. There may not be a fine, but those are significant penalties for failing to get the vaccine. So I think they all count, to my mind, as what I would call a mandate. They're just not a government mandate. I'll be very surprised if there's a government mandate for the next year or so. I think government mandates tend to follow the private sector mandates.
And so I'm hearing from our ethical experts that maybe in this case, the public good, the public benefit outweighs the individual autonomy. Is that what the other panelists agree with that? Or, that's, I think, where the debate tends to lie.
I think there's always a tension between the ethics that we as medical professionals practice, George practices, Matt, that we practice at the bedside versus what the community needs, which may not align with what the person we're caring for in front of us in the ICU for George, on the wards for Matt. This is a difficult concept for a country like this that is so focused on individual privileges and values that the common good is something that we struggle with a lot.
Gets right back to George's original story.
Yeah.
Are we in fact all in this together?
Yes, we are.
And if we are, then that means some of us, it means we make these trade-offs about liberties. And I think, the really simplistic way to think about this is, do you agree that we ought to have stoplights?
Mm-hmm.
If you agree that we ought to have stoplights to regulate traffic so that people don't run into each other, then, you've already agreed that there is some constraint on individual freedom that a civilized community is allowed to enact. And now the question becomes, where is the limit to that? And there should be limits, there must be limits, right? The question is where, and that's where all the discussion takes place, is where do you put that limit? How constrained are we allowed as a community to come together and set rules that prevent you from doing what you might want to do, right? And everyone agrees that, we don't allow people to murder, right? That is against the law everywhere. But that's a constraint on my liberty. What if I want to kill someone, right? So if you agree that there can be laws against murder, then you've opened Pandora's box and started the ethical conversation about, okay, well, if that measure of the harm principle is applicable, what about, am I allowed to, walk into a crowded barbershop when I have COVID without wearing a mask. Is that okay? Well, that's the question, right? Is that okay? And, for those of us in public health, that seems like a no-brainer, actually. No, you should not be allowed to walk around and spread COVID if there are easy things you can do that are relatively minor infringements on your liberty. Those are justifiable, but that's a legitimate conversation. I mean, there are people who are very frightened of this vaccine.
Yes.
I think that that fear, is not justified on the basis of scientific facts, but it is a real fear. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to deal with that and address the reasons for that fear, the reasons for the mistrust of the medical care system, the reasons for the mistrust of government, right? These have real bases that we have to take seriously. But it does not mean just because people have, a fear that everyone else has to accommodate to that and take on additional risk. That's the person's, saying, well, I'm afraid someone's going to get too close to me. I'm going to keep swinging my arm all the time. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if I hit people.
It's so simple and yet complicated. I think, unfortunately, we could talk about this for days, and we have such a great expert panel, but we have reached our time. I'm going to just close with, we are all in this together, and I really like that sentiment. Thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank all of our really expert speakers and our student organizers, Arij, and the CWA team that really put this together for us. If you would like to support the speakers and learn more about their work, you can find their books, podcasts, and social media accounts linked on the CWA website. The CWA relies on generous people like you to make the event possible. If you'd like to consider making a gift, you can do so at www.colorado.edu/CWA. Tune in through Sunday, April 11th for live CWA events, or catch up on those you've missed on the CWA YouTube channel. And thanks so much to all of our speakers once again, and thanks to all of you for joining us.